Hi and welcome to the Unquendor Guitars workshop. My name is Daniel and this is the second part of the video series where I'm working on my entry for the 2021 Great Guitar Build-Off. In the previous episode I started this gorgeous looking neck, and like last week I have a huge to-do list for this episode. I'm going to do the inlay on the 12th fret, of course fret dots, side markers, frets, Headstock Veneer, Unquendor logo inlay and some tuner holes. So yeah, let's get busy. I'm going to start by making my inlays, and for those familiar with my channel it may not come as a big surprise that I'm going to use aluminum or aluminium as my inlay material. I've got my two inlays printed out so I can stick them on the aluminum and cut them out using my little jeweler saw. So I start by sticking the printed out design to the piece of aluminum using some super glue. And I use my cordless drill to drill tiny holes for all the inside cuts I need to do on these inlays. And then I take my jeweler saw with a special metal cutting blade to cut out all the inlays. And it's quite labor intensive to cut these inlays out by hand, but I haven't found a method of doing it any other way, and I think it's very relaxing to spend a couple of hours cutting out these inlays. And I clean up and refine all the cuts using a very small diamond file. And here you can see me put a piece of cloth backed sandpaper in my jeweler saw to help me sand the inside of these inlays. I've got my inlays prepared, so time to do the actual inlay for the 12th fret position. And you might be wondering why I radiused the fretboard before doing the inlay, and that's because the aluminum sands away at a different rate than the surrounding wood, creating a possible pivot point when radius sanding, making it very complicated and hard to do. Also the aluminum gives off black dust when sanding, possibly contaminating the surrounding wood. So yeah, doing it this way is a bit more complicated with routing and doing the actual inlay, but I think it saves me from a lot of trouble I would have otherwise. So yeah, let's start doing the inlay. And of course I start by masking off the fretboard and mark the position where the inlay is going to be. And once the position is good, I use some super glue to stick the design to the fretboard. And of course use a scalpel blade to trace the design, so I can get a template to route the inlay. And then it's time to take out the Dremel with the smallest router bit I could find to create the cavity for the inlay, and glue in the aluminum pieces. And use some super glue and some dust to fill in any possible gaps or seams that might be visible. And I use a little file and some sandpaper to sand the inlay flush with the fretboard. And here's the end result. And I also like to make my own aluminum fret position markers. And I cut them from a 5mm diameter aluminum rod using a little jig I made. Installing fret position markers is pretty straightforward. Just mark the positions you want them to go. And then use a small and very sharp drill bit to drill a hole with the correct diameter and just tap in the position markers. And a nice thing about working with aluminum is that it compresses when you tap it with a hammer, so you get a very tight fit, almost no seam visible. And of course I need to do some filing and some sanding to get the fret position markers flush with the fretboard. Recutting the fret slots through the aluminium is always a bit scary. I'm always afraid I end up with too wide a fret slot. With both the inlay and the fret position markers in the fretboard, it's time to make sure the fretboard is nice and level. And then I can polish the fretboard to a high shine using various grits of sandpaper. And I like to wipe it down with just a piece of tissue paper, and I don't add any oil at this stage. This is the natural shine of the fretboard after polishing. And then it's time to start thinking about the headstock veneer. So I took this piece of Cerakote, it's the same wood I'm going to use for the top of this guitar, and I cut the outline on the bandsaw. And because I don't trust my bandsaw to make an accurate cut, I cut the veneer by hand using my Japanese saw. And of course I use my spindle sander thicknesser trick to get the headstock veneer to the correct thickness. I always forget about the table salt in your wood glue trick to keep your parts from sliding. So I struggled quite a bit while I was attempting to glue this veneer to the headstock to add some clamps and to get it all aligned in place. But in the end it's all worked out. I always keep my headstock veneer a bit oversized so I can make a very accurate slot where the nut is going to sit. So it's nice and tight and doesn't require almost any glue to keep it in place once the guitar is done. I've got my tuner holes marked and attached a backing block to the back of the headstock to prevent tear out and to have a nice surface so I can fit the headstock under my pillow drill. Now let's drill these tuner holes. I really love the added clamp to this Bosch pillar drill. It makes it very accurate to drill these holes. And yeah, of course I use a dedicated 10mm breadpoint drill bit to drill these tuner holes and yeah, to prevent any tear out. The last thing to do to the headstock is doing the Unquendor Guitars logo inlay, and of course when you're this far in a build, especially for the neck, it's always a bit scary to do, so hopefully I don't mess this up. And the process I'm using here is exactly the same as I did for the 12 fret logo inlay. Just mark the position, stick the design to the headstock and yeah, start routing. So let's put on some music and get the inlay done. The neck is almost done. Last thing to do is insert the frets, and of course I'm going to start with cleaning all the fret slots and make a little V groove so it's easier for me to insert the frets and if this guitar ever needs a refret job, it helps to prevent tear out when pulling out the frets again. And after that, of course, I'm going to use my fret press to press in all the frets, do a level, recrown and fret end dressing, and put in some side dots. And I use just a triangular file to make the little V groove, and just run it back and forth in every fret slot. And then I use a modified feeler gauge to make sure there's no dust and debris left in the fret slots before pressing in the frets. And before I can press in the frets, of course, I need to cut them all. Using a fret press is pretty straightforward. Just put a fret in a fret slot and press it in, and it's much more accurate and less noisy than using a fretting hammer. And I always double press my frets, once before cutting the fret ends and once afterwards. And that's because of the fret wire can compress from cutting, and that may lift the fret ends from the fretboard. And because I don't use super glue while I press in my frets, because I don't want super glue getting all over my nicely polished fretboard, I fill the tiny little gaps underneath the fret ends with some very low viscosity super glue and some dust from the sides afterwards. And I use a fret end file and a sanding beam to flatten the fret ends, get rid of the super glue and dust, and to create the 30-degree bevel on the fret ends. Well, most people probably don't like doing fretwork. I really love doing it, and I think it's maybe the most important job on any guitar, because a good fretwork, a good fret job makes a great guitar. It helps so much with playability and the enjoyment of playing the guitar when you have nicely done fretwork. So after filling the gaps underneath the frets and creating a bevel on the side of the frets, I'm going to take a 380 grit sandpaper and run it across the edge of the fretboard, both to round over the sharp edge of the fretboard and also smooth out the fret ends even more. Next, I'm going to take my fret end dressing file and remove the sharp corners on the edges, outer edges of the frets. Then, of course, level the frets, recrown them, do the Unquendor style bullet point fret ends, and then, of course, polish the frets. I could really talk for hours about the importance of fretwork and how to go about doing a proper fret job, but yeah, that would be way too long for this video. So if you haven't seen it, on my channel there's a tutorial on fretwork and how I do my fretwork. So if you're interested, yeah, check out the description down below and the link in the screen for more in-depth information on how I go about doing my fretwork. Another great benefit of using a fret press instead of a fretting hammer and being very careful with making your fretboard is that in this case I needed very little leveling on my frets, so it was a very easy job to do. I always create a very slight fall off on the last 7 frets on my necks, and that helps with setting a very low action and to improve playability of the guitar. And to recrown my frets I use a triangular crowning file, and that lets me very accurately shape the frets and get a very slim line on top of the frets. And after recrowning I round over all the fret ends to create my Unquendor style bullet type fret ends. And then I take various grits of sandpaper starting at 400 and ending with 2000 to remove all the scratches from the frets. Although I used a 2000 grit sandpaper to polish these frets by hand, now I'm going over them with a Dremel, and you can see the difference it makes between a polished fret with a Dremel and the one done by hand. I now have very shiny and polished frets, and last night I got so excited about doing the actual fretwork I forgot to do the side dots, and yeah, that's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to use a 2mm piece of aluminum wire, and very carefully, without damaging the side of the fretboard or hitting the frets, I'm going to install some side dots. And of course, first I'm using my handy little protractor to mark the spots where I want my side dots to go. And then use a very small drill bit to drill a tiny little hole. And because I'm afraid of spilling super glue onto my neck, I dip the end of the aluminum wire in a bit of super glue and install the side dot. Now with the side dots in, this neck is done and I can move on to the body, but unfortunately that will be in the next episode. As always, I hope you liked this video, and if you did, let me know by leaving a like, and if you have any questions, suggestions, comments, let me know in the comment section down below. If you're new to my channel and you liked what you've seen, yeah, please consider subscribing and hit that little notification bell so you get notified when I upload something new. Yeah, like I said, the next episode will be making the body for this great guitar build-off entry of mine, and I hope to see you all there. But until then, have a nice week.